Good evening. Welcome to the Bible study. If you have your Bibles, please turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 5. Hebrews, chapter 5. Last time we were introduced to Jesus as our high priest. And as our high priest, he sympathizes with our weaknesses. And the very next verse says, so we can with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Hebrews 5 continues the subject of Jesus as a high priest. In fact, it goes, I think, well into chapter 7. Hebrews 5, the verses that we're looking at today, which is 1 to 10, it can be divided into two sections. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, the requirements of the Levitical or Aaronic priesthood, and then verses 5 to 10 demonstrate how Christ fulfilled those requirements. So, Hebrews 5 1 to 4. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So here, some people say three. You can even say four. There are three or four qualifications that are mentioned for the high priest. Number one, he should be a man. He should belong to the human race. Number two, he should be. His role is to offer sacrifices and gifts on behalf of the people. And number three, he should be compassionate. He should deal gently. And number four, he can take that position, that role of being a high priest, only via divine appointment. It is God who calls the high priest. And the high priest, interestingly, was chosen from among men. I mean, if we think about it, God could have used angels to be our high priests or mediators, but he had to be a man. That was the first qualification. In the Old Covenant, that word covenant, sometimes we say Old Testament, is better translated Old Covenant and New Covenant. So in the Old Covenant, the high priest maintained God's temple. He would refill the bread and the wine. He would trim the wicks of the lamps. He would maintain all the different objects that were used in worship. That all came under his responsibilities. And one of his main responsibilities, as we know, was to offer sacrifices and gifts. So there were the sin offerings, and the climax of that would have been the Day of Atonement. And the other offerings were the gift offerings, the peace offerings. This was all part of worship to God. So that was the most important role of the high priest under the old covenant. And if you can read about the Day of Atonement or the Yom Kippur in Leviticus chapter 16. And it happened once a year on the 10th day of the seventh month of the Hebrew calendar, the month of Tishri, which corresponds with in our Gregorian calendar, it will be September, October. So all these rituals that took place on that one particular day, you can read about in Leviticus chapter 16, 1 to 34. Aaron could not enter the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was that innermost place in the temple. He could not enter it on any other day except on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. So before he entered, there were certain things he had to do in order to prepare himself. He had to have a bath and he had to put on the special garments that were prescribed, and then he had to offer a bull as a sacrifice for his sins and his family's sins. And he would sprinkle the blood of that bull on the mercy seat, and then he would take two goats, and two goats would be brought. One goat would be sacrificed for the rebellion, for the uncleanness of the nation of Israel, and the second goat would be made a scapegoat. And so Aaron would place his hands on its head, confessed over it the rebellion and the wickedness and the sinfulness of the Israelites, and with a designated man, this goat would be sent out into the wilderness. That's all we know. But then tradition also says that the goat would be pushed over a steep cliff so that it will not return to the camp. And so the two goats that we read about in the Old Covenant are symbolic. You can say they point to two aspects of Christ's atonement, that is the propitiation and the expiation. The propitiation is basically the appeasement of divine wrath. God appeased, Jesus appeased the wrath of God. And then number two is expiation, which is the removal of sin. So both those aspects of Christ's atoning work can be seen in the goats. The goats were a foreshadowing of it. And then in verse 2, it says, in regards to this high priest, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward. Again, something that's interesting is when you look at the old covenant or the Old Testament, all the sin offerings were mainly for unintentional sins. I think in the book of Numbers it says there's no offering for high-handed sins. I mean, there were certain things that can be done intentionally, like if you bear false witness, there was a sacrifice. But high-handed sins, there was no such thing. Only on the day of Yom Kippur can all those sins be atoned for, sins like adultery, all the big sins, murder, those kind of sins. But for here in verse 2, it says he can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset. So there were sacrifices for unintentional sins. And the high priest was expected to be compassionate. He was expected to deal gently with people. And even just earlier, I was discussing with my wife about how sometimes in the Greek, even though we are not Greek scholars, I'm definitely not a Greek scholar just because I took a basic level Greek class in seminary. Just a basic level doesn't mean we suddenly become or talk about ourselves as scholars. But just because we don't know Greek or we have a very basic knowledge doesn't mean, as somebody used to say, doesn't mean we can't read the scholars who are authorities and who are experts in Greek. And I really like every now and then looking up the Greek words, not to make it more boring or to make it more scholarly, simply because it provides a nuance that the English will not provide, the English translation. So here, when it says deal gently, it's the word metripatheo, and it speaks of feeling toward the ignorant and erring, which is neither too severe nor too tolerant. He must be the high priest. He must not become irritated and judgmental at the sin of the ignorant. At the same time, he must also make sure he doesn't approve of the sin. So he must strike this delicate balance, and that you'll get all this only when you look at the original. Otherwise, you just say deal gently. It doesn't give you that level of detail as to what exactly it means. And I like this Greek word and what it connotes, because I think it instructs us as well when we hear about the sin of somebody else. How do we react? Generally, the tendency is to be a little bit overly critical and overly judgmental rather than the opposite. I mean, some may be very sympathetic and they may be too tolerant of the sin as well. But this word over here, talking about the high priest, tells us that we must strike that delicate balance. You can't be too tolerating of the sin. At the same time, you can't be too judgmental of the sin. And then verse 3, it says, while the high priest was a man, and this was the advantage because he could identify with people. His sinful humanity was the disadvantage. The advantage was he was a man, he could identify with the people that he ministered to or he offered sacrifices on behalf of. But the disadvantage was he was a sinful man. He had to offer sacrifices for himself and his family as well. And then when you look at verse 4, it says, the high priest must be called of God. No one takes his honor for himself, but only when called by God, as in the case of Aaron. So let me just remind you of that story in Numbers chapter 16. I have preached a message on Numbers 16 when we were going through systematically through the book of Jude, which I think has about 16 verses, but we took about 8 weeks to go through that short book with only one chapter. That time I preached a message on the rebellion of Korah, but now very briefly, in maybe a minute or so, I just want to remind you of what happened there. In the main antagonist in number 16 was Korah, and he was from the tribe of Levi. He was a son of Levite. So the complaint that he brought to Moses was that priesthood belonged to everyone. Everyone should be a priest. And that wasn't true in the old covenant. It's true in the new, but not in the old. So Moses' response during that time was he fell on his face and he said that the Lord would decide. And God's response, if you recollect what Numbers 16 says, God's response was basically the earth opened up and it swallowed Korah and all the rebels with him, all those who joined him. And fire consumed 250 men offering incense. A plague broke out, killing 14,700 people. And the plague finally came to an end only when Aaron, the high priest, intervened and he made atonement. He lit up a censer and he made atonement. But by the time, already 14,700 people had been killed. And then when you look at Numbers chapter 7, God instructs them to take the rod, the staff of the head of each tribe, each of the 12 tribes, and write their name on it and leave it in the temple. So God does this as a test. So all the heads of the tribes, they write their name on their staff or on their rod and they place it in the tabernacle. The next day, only Aaron's staff blossomed, only that budded and grew almonds overnight. And that was God's way of showing that Aaron was the chosen one. Aaron was the one that God had called to be the high priest. That was his way of showing that Aaron had his approval. And so priesthood, at least in the Old Testament, high priests were called directly by God. And a modern application would be even today when you have people in ministry, pastors, they should be called of God. They should receive both that internal call, they should feel that calling, and people on the outside should affirm that God has placed that calling on them. They should affirm they have that ability to be a shepherd. And then when you read verses 5 and 6, it says, so also Christ did not exalt himself. Did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And as he says also in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Starting in verse 5, right up to verse 10, the author shows us how Jesus met all the qualifications for the high priest mentioned. The qualification for the high priest mentioned in verses 1 to 4. That's why I call this study Jesus is a qualified high priest. The previous study was Jesus is a high priest, but now what the author is trying to show us is Jesus is qualified in being a high priest. And so, just like Aaron and the other high priests didn't exalt themselves to the position of a high priest, Jesus also didn't exalt himself. He was appointed by his Father. It was by divine appointment. And verse 6 says, Christ is a priest forever under the order of Melchizedek. I don't want to get into Melchizedek. He was a king from Salem, which is another word for Jerusalem. He's mentioned in Genesis. Abraham pays tithe. He gives 1/10 after he wins this victory in a war. And he comes and there's this priest king or this king priest called Melchizedek, and he blesses him, and Abraham pays tithe to him. But I don't want to get into the subject of Melchizedek right now because he's mentioned in detail later in chapter 7. So for now, all we need to keep in mind is that Christ's priesthood is eternal. It's not a temporal priesthood like the Aaronic priesthood, it's eternal under the priesthood of or under the order of Melchizedek. And we'll get to who he is and certain speculations about Melchizedek later when we come to that chapter. Verse 7 says, I'm reading, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save from death, and he was heard because of his reverence or his piety. During his earthly sojourn, Jesus prayed with loud cries. This most likely refers to the Garden of Gethsemane, but it is not limited to that. But when you read this verse, the first thing that comes to your mind is the Garden of Gethsemane, where he sweat drops of blood. But I'm sure, there are other times in the Gospels where it's mentioned Jesus cried, for example, at the tomb of Lazarus, and then during his passion, I think he wept over Jerusalem. So this is not limited, but the first thing that comes to mind is the Garden of Gethsemane, where he made loud cries and Jesus prayed with loud cries and tears to him who is able to save from death. In Greek, again, there are two words for from. One is the word apo, and that means from the edge of. And there's another word ek, and that means out from within. The second word is used over here, out from within. So Christ's prayer was not so much that he would be saved from dying. After all, the purpose for which he came to the earth was to die for sinful humanity. But his prayer was that he would be delivered out of death, that is, his soul won't be left in Hades. And that prayer was answered when God raised him on the third day. And then verse 8 goes on to say, although he was a son, although he was God's only son, only begotten son, he learned obedience through the things he suffered. It's a fascinating verse because even Jesus had to learn something. Now, this does not mean that by nature Jesus was disobedient. He had a disposition of obedience, but obedience, by definition, if you think about it, has to be learned experientially. I like what Griffith Thomas says, and Hewitt also adds. He says, this is the difference between innocency and virtue. Innocency is life untested, while virtue is innocency tested and triumphant. The son always possessed the disposition of obedience, but for him to possess the virtue of obedience, testing was necessary. So before Jesus stepped into the sinful world, I don't think he personally experienced suffering. But once he came to the earth, he would have seen suffering, he would have understood it theoretically. But once he stepped into the sinful world, he experienced suffering. And even when things were unpleasant, he still chose obedience. And so he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. The greatest example of that being the cross of Calvary. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, even if you say, I have very obedient children and I prove it to you, and you say, okay, children, eat an ice cream. They very gladly eat ice cream. You might say that's not a real test of obedience. A real test of obedience would be if you say, okay, children, go clean your rooms. And over there, because it's a challenging thing to do, you can see, you can test whether they really are obedient. Now, examples like that will always have limitations, but you must understand that over here, Jesus, it's not that he was being trying to be, I mean, he was disobedient and he had to be corrected, and he learned obedience in that sense. It just means that obedience by definition is something that is acquired only through experience. Only when you do certain things, you can observe people who are obedient, but only when you make choices in certain situations where there is the freedom to be disobedient can you gain this experience or you learn this obedience. And so going through the school of hard knocks, I mean, this is not an I this is it is an idea that is not foreign to scripture. Going through the school of hard knocks makes a person wise, makes a person experience. And I think it was Tozer who said it's highly doubtful that God can bless a man or use a man greatly unless he first hurts him deeply. And I think the greatest example of that is the Lord Jesus himself. Of course, there are many other examples, but Jesus was hurt deeply. I think not I think, he was the one who was hurt the most, but he was the one who was used so mightily of God the Father, and he was a blessing to all of humankind, all of mankind. And again, somebody beautifully said, if you cripple a man, you have Sir Walter Scott. You put him in prison, you lock him up in prison, and you have John Bunyan. You bury him in the snows of Valley Forge, you have George Washington. You raise him in abject poverty, and you have Abraham Lincoln. You burn him so severely in a schoolhouse fire that the doctors say he will never run again, and you have Glenn Cunningham, who in 1934 ran the fastest mile, that's 1,600 meters. He ran it in 4 minutes and 6 seconds. So you call him a slow learner. You have Albert Einstein. You have him born in a black society where racial discrimination is prevalent. You have Booker T. You have Harriet Tubman. You have MLK and all those reformers. And this can be said of many people like Corrie ten Boom. You can say it of Helen Keller. You can say it of Joni Eareckson Tada. Many people, Margaret Thatcher, people who have gone through suffering, have accomplished and done so much for the Lord. I think Spurgeon said it eloquently. He said, the Lord gets his best soldiers in the highlands of affliction. There was a young soldier who married a woman and took her to his post in the desert. She absolutely hated it. She couldn't stand it. She couldn't stand the sweltering heat, and sand blew over everything. There were all these sandstorms. Her only neighbors lived close by in an Indian village, and thing that she couldn't bear the most was the loneliness, because her husband would go off to duty and she was all alone in the house. So at one point she was fed up and she wrote her mother and she said, I've had enough. I'm coming home. I absolutely hate it here. I can't stand it over here. I'm coming home. After the mother received the message, she wrote back saying, she talked about the story. She said two men looked out through prison bars. One saw mud and the other one saw stars. Yeah, just a simple illustration, a simple story. But this lady, the newly married wife, got the message. She decided to look for the stars. She stayed back. She learned everything that she could about the desert, the language, the folklore, the all the tales, all the traditions of the Indians, and then she ended up writing the best-selling book regarding that desert and regarding the culture of those people. So nothing had changed. The circumstances didn't change. Only her perspective of it changed. She decided to look for the stars. Sometimes we so desperately want to get out of situations that we currently are facing without even giving it the slightest thought that maybe God has ordained for us to go through those things in order to grow. As son though he was, he suffered. He learned obedience rather through the things he suffered. There was this woman who went to a diet center and she wanted to lose weight. That was the goal. So she met the director of this diet center and he took her to a full length mirror. And on that mirror, he outlined a figure and told her that this is what you must look like in due time at the end of the program. And days and weeks went by, days and weeks of intense exercise and the intense dieting. And every week, the woman would stand in front of the mirror and she would be discouraged because her bulging outline didn't fit the director's ideal. But she kept at it. She was determined. She persevered. And one day she conformed to the image she longed for. When you place ourselves side by side with Christ, we are all out of shape, completely unfit, spiritually unfit. But to be transformed into image, it doesn't mean sinless perfection, but it does mean maturity. And the goal of Christianity, or at least one of the main goals, is to be conformed to the image of Christ. And we also allow all those trials that God allows, not the trials that come because of poor choices and decisions. That's a totally different subject. But the ones that God Himself allows, the testing that He brings in our life, the pain, the affliction, we allow it to shape us, to mold us, because the discipline, although not pleasant during the time that we're experiencing it, will eventually yield a harvest of righteousness, as the author of Hebrews will say later. So in verses 9 and 10, he says, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So again, that word perfect, something's, the whole New Testament, perfect sometimes can have the idea of completeness, it can have the idea of maturity. The word teleos, you can say something is teleos or perfect if it carries out the purpose for which it's designed, which is what I think the author's idea is over here. So the author is not thinking of some metaphysical perfection or something. He's thinking of if the object accomplishes the purpose for which it's designed, which is what I think he means here by teleos. So Christ was made a perfect high priest. It wasn't a role that he took on before, but he learned obedience through the things he suffered. He was made perfect, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation. And that word is the eternal salvation. Believers are kept safe both in time and eternity. Jesus accomplished so much for us, and especially during the season where we're approaching Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday, it's good to meditate on these things. Just want to end with a story or two. There was this 33-year-old Frenchman who was nailed to a cross on the patio of a plush hotel in the Dominican Republic as his contribution, I believe, to salvation and peace among mankind. He planned to hang on that cross for 3 days, but just 24 hours into this ordeal, he became too weak to carry on, and so he gave up his plan. And even before the 24 hours was up, they had to move the cross from a vertical position to a horizontal position just to alleviate him from his suffering and from his pain. And so the failure of this man stands in stark contrast with the suffering and the pain of Christ. And it wasn't even so much, I think, the physical suffering, as bad as it was, the torture and the humiliation. I think it was that fact that he lost contact or fellowship as he took on the sins of the world with his Father, because he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think that probably was the most painful thing for Jesus during that during his endurance of the cross and all the suffering that it brought, because he, from eternity past, he has been in perfect relationship with the Father, but bearing the sins of the world would have probably been even more painful than the physical suffering of the cross or the trauma that it brought, the excruciating pain that it brought. So I end with this story. On November 4th, 1979, a few rioting students went into the US embassy, since we're having all this war between the US and Iran. They went into this US embassy in Tehran, that's in Iran, and they took hostage 66 Americans. And for 14 months, there was no direct communication between US and these people, these American hostages. And the only way that they could communicate to them was through Canada. And finally, after 14 months, these hostages were released because of the efforts of this Algerian diplomat. And so the story goes to tell us and goes to show us how intermediaries can play such an important role, how mediators can play such a crucial role in diffusing a hostile situation. Just a little while ago, my wife and me were in the gym, and there was a guy who walked into the gym, and I don't know what exactly the details were, but he was arguing with the guy at the counter for quite some time. The argument kept going. It seemed like it was tapering down. Then again, it would start, and something to do with the membership. I think he had finished his membership, but he still wanted to avail the facilities at the gym. So he was going on arguing back and forth. That guy at the counter also arguing back and forth. This guy also arguing, going for 10-15 minutes. Finally, one of the guys in the gym, I think, stepped in, and he was, I was somewhere in the background, didn't want to be interrupted by a thing that was going. I was trying to do my work there. So, but I could see and hear a little bit that this guy was trying to play the role of a mediator, because first this guy spoke and he's explaining his situation, all animated, saying he's saying this, he's saying that. Then the other guy was explaining, and this guy was trying to be a mediator, trying to settle the matter between them. And again, it just shows us the importance of a mediator. And today, in the new covenant, in the new, as per whatever the New Testament tells us, we don't have to go to a priest. We don't have to go to a pastor in order to approach God. We don't have to tell the pastor. We don't have to confess to the pastor. Of course, the Bible says confess to one another for healing in James, but that's a totally different subject. We don't have to approach God through an intermediary, a human intermediary, a purely human, earthly intermediary. We have direct access to the throne room of God, because we ourselves belong to that group that are referred to as a royal priesthood in the book of. You and me, we're priests. We have direct access to the throne room of God. We don't need a priest to go there. And so that is the we can go to God directly, because we have a great high priest in Jesus Christ. And so that is Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 to 10.